I spent half my life as a clinician in something called the National Conduct Problems and Adoption and Fostering Clinic. So in a way, this is a perfect meeting for me, because conduct problems is antisocial behaviour which leads to offending, and adoption and fostering. But I have to confess I'm here under slightly false pretences, because I'm going to talk to you briefly about two trials. One is about offending in people who are still in their birth families, and one is about adopted and foster children, but they're not yet teenagers, so there's a gap. But Nina is going to fill the gap, so that's going to be exciting. So the causes are complex. I feel annoyed that often it's the care system that is blamed for this, but in fact, probably far more important are the two preceding factors, which is the abuse they've suffered and also their genetic potential. I think when I started 20 years ago, genetics wasn't thought about much, but now we have 2 or 3 really good Scandinavian studies where they have both twin and adoption studies showing the genetic contribution to antisocial behaviour, which surprised me. I was brought up with that, if you have a difficult time, then you reject society and so on. But in one of the most famous studies, which was a cross-adoption study, where they took birth parents who were either criminal or alcoholic or not, and saw how they did, and the adopting parents were either criminal or alcoholic or not. So it's a complicated design and it's crude measures, but what was interesting, if you had, quotes, good genetic potential and then well brought up, i.e. your birth parents weren't alcoholic or criminal, and nor were your adoptive parents, the rate of criminality by 17 was 3%. If, however, you had the same low genetic risk, were brought up by criminal or alcoholic parents, that more than doubled to 7%. So that was the environmental effect, which I expected. However, when you took the high-risk kids, even if they were brought up with non-alcoholic and criminal parents, they had a criminality rate of 12%, suggesting quite a strong genetic contribution. But what was really striking was if you had both difficult cards, if you like, if you had a genetic risk and you were brought up in an environment, bang, the rate went up to 40% being in the criminal justice system. So there was an interaction going on that if you had a slightly more difficult temperament and then you had this harsher or more abusive upbringing, you're much more likely to be ending up in the criminal justice system. And of course, related to that is attachment security and whether you feel loved and can get on, but also things like lower IQ, therefore dropping out of school, having specific learning disabilities like dyslexia, having ADHD, which we've shown quite a lot of our kids in our clinic have. All these things predispose to more difficult outcomes. So I now therefore want to switch to 2 different trials, not where we've addressed the genetic risk factors, you can't, nor the early abusive upbringing or the current not good upbringing in the offenders living in their birth families, to see what might work. It may seem obvious to all of you here, but actually testing things out is really important. I still go around and I'd say most youth offending interventions for young offenders, most interventions for looked after children are because, well, I know it works, it makes good sense. They're untested. And I think that is ethically reprehensible. I think at least 5 or 10% of the budget of any offending service that should be on evaluation. Otherwise, we're letting the children down. Having a background in medicine, I'm fond of saying if you had appendicitis and you went for an operation and the surgeon said, yes, well, there are things that work, but hey, I've got my own special little way of doing things, so we don't really know if it works. You wouldn't really like it very much, and you might have worse outcomes. Why is children's happiness, well-being and future lives less important than your appendix? So, functional family therapy is an attractive proposition because children have very disturbed starts who have been looked after, and family factors, rejection, hostility, lack of positive involvement are important. And we wanted to do a UK trial of that, and this is with children in their birth families, but who are young offenders, and we carried this out in Brighton. And so I'm going to tell you about that. NICE, by the way, Guidelines on Antisocial Behaviour, did a specific review on children with fostered children with antisocial behaviour. So there's quite a reasonably up-to-date, that was published last April, review in that. And they recommend parent training for children under 12 in their birth families, but they also recommend a similar approach for fostered children. There is a large trial of multi-systemic therapy to try to keep people in their birth families who are on the edge of care, which I'm involved in, which we'll be reporting soon. 700 kids, 350 in each group, but they're not yet in looked after care. So functional family therapy is based on systemic family therapy. It's well worked out. It's got a chap called Jim Alexander who started it off. And the aim is to improve family interaction and reduce the risk of people going into foster care. And there is some evidence that that works in the US. So they had, I'm going to read it from the screen, I'm afraid. I can't read this. A good reduction in recidivism rate, that's reoffending, a quarter as opposed to half in the controls in the States. And another trial, a bigger reduction, 9% reoffending in functional family therapy versus 41% in the control group. So, yeah, if it's so effective, why do we need to test it again? I think America is different. There were some trials in Canada which didn't show an effect, quite a big trial. And one in Sweden which didn't show an effect. So that was quite important for multisystemic therapy, although there's a positive one in the UK for offenders. And for treatment foster care, we're going to hear later this morning from Nina. And the other point is there are vested interests here, which can work in conscious and unconscious ways. Yes, they're not drug companies whose share price and CEOs whose bonuses are going to go down from 8 million to 4 million if they don't have it. And I'd like to point out that every major drug corporation has been fined by the FDA in the States, several millions or billions in the last 2 years. They are all fraudulently presenting their trial data. But it's becoming increasingly interesting whether psychological interveners, perhaps not because some of them are going to make money, MST make money out of it. Functional family therapy does have a for-profit arm, but it's much smaller. So we just have to watch out for those things because their income, their training, their passion too is going to be less. So there haven't been many independent trials of functional family therapy, and this one was independent. We got their advice in doing the intervention right, but we were financially independent of them, and no one was involved in gathering the data from their team. So we took 111 young people and their families from youth offending services, and this is in Brighton, something called Targeted Youth Support Services, who also see people who are very close to offending. The majority were actual offenders. And they were randomised either to management as usual and functional family therapy, or management as usual, and we paid for them to have some top-up hours with their youth workers so that it wouldn't just be a possible effect of just somebody caring about you and spending time with you, to try and eliminate that as a possible explanation. And we saw them before they were randomised 6 months later, and then 18 months, because even if there's a short-term effect, we didn't just want that, although that would have been positive. We want to see if this is going to lead to systemic change, which we hope, since if the family is functioning better, that will be a good thing to happen. So we did all the usual stuff, multi-informant, multi-method, and the main outcome we are interested in for today is a self-reported delinquency. The carer's account, the parent's account of their oppositional defiant symptoms, which is sort of small level, yeah, boo, sucks, nasty, having a tantrum, and conduct disorder symptoms, which is more major stuff, driving and taking away cars, violence to people, that sort of thing, and police records of convicted offences, which was important to us because it's independent of the parent feeling, well, I really like this team, I'm going to sort of think this has been good. And we thought we should see whether the proximal change, which is the quality of parenting, should happen. So we tested that by something called the hot topics. The young person, the adolescent, says the 3 most irritating things about their parent, and the parent says the 3 most irritating things about their child. You don't come in, you leave your smelly socks, whatever, or only old boring old fart, you never do anything with me from the child's point of view, you always make me come in at 10 o'clock, whatever. Then we let them go at it for 10 minutes and code whether they are warm, can take turns, be respectful, bring out the good aspects of the child. So who was involved? They were 3/4 boys, 15, this is in bright and white British, strikingly low IQs, which is found repeatedly, but it is worth saying that's a whole standard deviation down. This is just important and looked after, and a lot of that is genetic, not just lack of good education. If you look at studies of similar kids still in their birth families, they are of similar IQ. And the parents were mainly more disadvantaged, left school before 16, and were predominantly single parents. So this is something, it's a home visiting. We thought if you wait for them to turn up, as some services do, you've got to show readiness and commitment. That wouldn't be a starter. We've got to get in there and visit them at home. And the team were very good at that on the whole, because these are quite difficult families. And over 3/4 completed the intervention satisfactorily, and they attended nearly all of their things. So they got a reasonable go of what it was, which, so you go into the home, there's an engagement stage where you try and engage them, then you start reconnoting the positive, more positively some of the negative behaviours, and then you go into more usual stuff like supervising them, encourage them to get out of bed and go to the training centre, all the usual stuff. So, what happened? Did it improve the self-reported delinquent act? It's been pretty successful in America. We had pretty skilled people doing it, which I'll come on to, really experienced family therapists, weekly phone calls to the US to make sure they said we were doing well. Now, of course, they're American and looking positive, but I still think it was about as damn good as you'd get it anywhere it was rolled out into England. So we were really pleased that this was going to show a good effect on these kids who need it so much. So the control group are the red, the blue group are the functional family therapy group. So this is their self-reported criminal acts. Not much difference there, not a smidgen of difference. Okay, well perhaps be other variables. What about the official records? No difference again. Fortunately, functional family therapy didn't make them worse, but it didn't make them any better. And we got very good help from the police records centre in getting these. They're really independent. Okay, well, given all these things, maybe at home things would be better. The conduct problem symptoms, no difference in that at either time point, or the smaller low-level stuff, if that's it. Maybe they're still going out and nicking stuff, but maybe they're a bit nicer at home. No difference in the parental report of that. Okay, but what about actually doing it, videotaping them at home? No difference on that. Hopefully they would have got better at knowing where their kids are and supervising and monitoring them. No. So, pretty spectacular failure, really. Which was depressing, having spent 5 years of my life in this trial. So everybody reduced it over time for the offending and antisocial.
I just wondered if you could comment on that.
Well, I will come on to that, because obviously we've had a little thinkette about this. And no difference on all those measures I'm telling you about, nor indeed on the parenting, and I haven't shown you some parental report yet. Okay. It's not, our sample was over 100, so it wasn't bad as these trials go. We had the power to detect a difference. It isn't just if only we'd heard a few numbers, it would be statistically significant.
Sorry, could you speak up slightly?
Yeah, sorry. We had the power to detect a difference. So here are some possible explanations why it didn't work. the people weren't good enough. They went off model. There's quite a lot of evidence about sticking to the model and doing it really well is important. This is skilled work. And that's come out again and again in the literature. There was contagion, that the people in the same office saw their colleagues doing functional family therapy, and therefore they learned how to do it. There was too much that actually having treatment as usual, and this is what one of the program developers thought, that having management as usual and people coming around and giving you family, it was too much, too many visits happening per day, and it was kind of a bit too much, and they're contradictory with the youth worker saying they've got to be ready and express themselves, and the functional family therapist saying, no, you've got to get them to the centre. Was that going on? Was there interference of the treatments? Were they all just getting better anyway and getting better? And finally, was are we not so bad as we're always reading in the Daily Mail, except for I don't read the Daily Mail, about how rubbish offending services are and how people should be locked up and throw away the key. These are the explanations I want to have a quick look at with. Well, first of all, this is an American study in Washington State, not Washington, D.C., of functional family therapy. It's not a trial of comparing control group. It is of the more than 20 people who were trained during their 5-day initial training, whether the trainer thought they got it or not. There's a 4-point scale, so those who got it pretty much or definitely got a 3 and a 4, and those who didn't really get it were 2, and those who really didn't get it were 1. These are here collapsed into 2 different groups. Sorry, it was a trial. So the control group, this is felony, which is quite a serious offence. We abolished it in 1664 in England. 27% of the control group. However, of those who did, the competent therapists reduced that to 17%. That's worthwhile. That's a 40% reduction. The other half of the therapeutic group who didn't get it didn't make any difference, verging on making them worse. So we do have evidence that this is skilled work and that just having low-grade workers is less likely to work. That is in the US. But our therapists were highly skilled. They're all MSc levels, more skilled than in the US studies. They were trained by the Jim Alexander, the founder, who's a lovely chap, weekly telephone calls, and we had regular trips to the US to really be on model, and they felt they learnt a lot. And then somebody slightly different from the trainer, but in their company, but he didn't talk to them, evaluated the skill level, the fidelity with which they were doing it, and so that you can see 0 to 2, which is on the left-hand axis, 2 is here, is inadequate. Adequate is 3, 4, excellent is 5 to 7. And you will see, on the whole, as the trial went on, to begin with they weren't so thin, but they got up there to what is adequate. Not brilliant, but adequate. So they're not at 5 to 7. So I think they're probably as good as you're likely to get in real life. Afterwards, post hoc, it was felt that maybe there wasn't enough intensity going in the beginning, that they would have weekly visits at home or something like that, and that actually probably, they've now developed the model, they think you probably need to go into the home 2 or 3 times a week for the first month to really get a change. That actually when you've got entrenched problems, often difficult parents, on their own, under a lot of stress, getting the parents to change and the young people is more work than even this was showing in the States. But as it was at the time, 5 years ago, this was reasonably skilled work in terms of rollout. What about contagion and interference? Did the youth offending services learn from FFT therapists and therefore improve their outcomes in the control group? So we looked at that imperfectly, but seeing whether the control group outcomes got better over the course of the trial, which took place over 3 years. They didn't. So insofar as they were learning something, that didn't seem to be the case. In the US, rather than having management as usual, functional family therapy is all they get. They get very little, whereas here they couldn't not have their court-ordered youth offending worker visiting them once a month at least and checking up, and sometimes they were tagged. But there was no relationship between number of contact hours and the outcomes in either group, so giving them more wasn't related to outcomes. Of course, that's not random, because the more difficult kids would get more. So one has to take that with a pinch of salt. Was something that the yacht workers were doing undermining functional therapy, but it didn't look like it, because we looked carefully about if they'd got more management as usual, did they do worse or better, but no, they didn't. And another study comparing functional family therapy and management unusual didn't find that management unusual undermined it. So I think that's unlikely as an explanation. Were they getting better anyway, just because the majority it was a first offence, and there's quite a lot of agency involvement? They've been told, if you do this again, if you breach your stuff, it'll be young offending institution for you, son. And some of them got tagged. But they, nonetheless, although they did improve in the first 6 months, they didn't in the 6 to 18 months, so it doesn't explain everything. The next issue is, as you may know, Tammy Moffat and others have done this thing where amongst offenders, those who've got early onset do much worse because of all the biological factors, whereas some just get in a bit of trouble as a teenager, go and piss in a bus shelter, end up in court. The adolescent onset group do better. It's more of a normative peer experience for quite a few of them. We had half early onset and half later onset. So did it work with either group? But no effect in either group, no difference. It wasn't that this overall null effect was hiding an improvement in one group, such as the adolescent onset, and not the early onset. So that doesn't seem to be an explanation. So that was that trial. I do think that in quite a lot of the states things, they get quite negative stuff. Some of them get incarcerated, and there's quite a lot of evidence emerging that prison is actually criminogenic. So the trials in the States might be comparing, possibly, doing something that doesn't do much good versus something that's actively harmful, and then if you keep them out of prison, that might be good. That's not the only explanation, but that could be part of it. So what do I conclude from that? Be careful before you go ahead and do something, because it must be the best thing since sliced bread. And if I were to do it again, I'd do it more intensively, and I would have more of an education component to it as well. So before I completely depress you all, I just want to talk about a trial we did for looked after children, but these were younger. These were from 4 to 12. These were fostered children. We've developed in our team a program called Fostering Changes. It's based on social learning theory and also attachment theory. And one of our other studies, which was pleasing, where we took the attachment status of the young people and we compared them. We got them to talk about their birth parents, because now can do that because quite a lot of them have contact, and their foster parents, because there was a notion that it's done for. I'm a great believer in early intervention myself, but there's a bit of, well, if you're not sorted by two, if you've got insecure attachment, you're stuffed and trussed and oven ready, really. This isn't the case. In our study, we found that the majority of kids made secure attachments to their foster carers, and this was as good as control kids in their biological families. So foster care is a good thing, and that despite these kids being more difficult than non-fostered kids, the warmth and supervision, everything in the foster families was just as good as in the birth families. This is UK foster care, not US foster care. However, the outcomes are still not very good, so we wanted to do this program, which we did. Now, we wanted to look at their attachment. So this is something called the QUARQ, the Quality of Attachment Relationship Questionnaire. Does the young person come to you when they're upset and come close to you, talk about things, perhaps have a cuddle? Will they let you in? Will they allow you to look after them? Will they accept praise, sort of saying, oh, I'm rubbish and that sort of thing? And can they show affection? Because my father and son are both theoretical physicists, I was pleased to call it this, because the quark is a particle that's at the heart of the matter. So beforehand, this was the score of control groups and intervention groups, and after you will see the intervention group, who are the green compared with the controls, have increased their attachment security using carer measure, which is probably as good as any. So that was encouraging, that here was a 12-week intervention that could improve attachment security further in looked after children. Then, of course, there is whether the carer actually feels confident, whether they feel they can cope with the child, and that increased again. And for some reason, one of my slides that's come off is whether their disruptive behaviour, what the parent was finding difficult, improved, and that improved too. So this was in under 12s, but it definitely shows that a good quality intervention over 12 weeks, this is a group of foster carers, can make a difference. So let's think about the differences from the functional family therapy trial. Slightly different intervention. Foster carers are probably got more headspace to be able to change things. The families in the functional family therapy trial were not terribly functional. They were often negative, they'd often had a difficult childhood themselves, they were overwhelmed, which is one of the reasons that led, in Oregon Social Learning Centre, the Nina's trial, that she's going to talk about, to be developed, because they had worked with teenagers in families, and they found the families were so burnt out that to give the children a chance of something, they were put into treatment foster care for 6 months instead of going to jail, and then put back in the family. Of course, you need to do some work with the family, but that was the basis of it. So I think foster carers are doing a good job and can do a good job, and that's really important. The other thing to say is that we are doing groups with teenagers, but we haven't got a trial of those yet, so we should probably be seeking funding to do a trial of it with teenagers. So, quite a lot to absorb, I think. Judy.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much indeed. Very clear, and hopefully you could hear it at that end when Stephen just upped his voice a little. Any questions or comments? Yeah. Do you want to introduce yourself so that we can...
Hi, sorry. Hi, I'm Andy Wilkinson from NSPCC. A question about the FFT. Did it, either in the States or here, did it try and look at entry to care as an indicator?
No, because not enough were going into care. The numbers would have been too small. Because they're relatively young, they're not right up there. But however, the MST trial being done in Britain will look at that, and that's got bigger numbers, and they are right on the edge of care when they come in. And that will be reporting, hopefully, in the next few months.
Okay, Ingrid and then Lucy.
I'm Ingrid Höjer from Gothenburg University.
From?
Gothenburg University.
Yes.
Department of Social Work. I just thank you for an interesting presentation. It's always interesting when you actually can see the results of such projects, so thank you. I only have a short comment concerning the IQ results, because in some Swedish studies you could actually see that foster children who had very low IQ in the tests, if they got interventions in school, the IQ changed.
Yes.
So the IQ is really dependent on the context. It's not something that's there and cannot change. So I feel a bit reluctant to using the IQ figures for these groups of children, because I think it...
Okay, well, I used to take that position, but I've changed because I think all the poor things, they haven't had a chance and had good education, and no IQ test is perfect. But as a group, I'm still convinced of difference, and I agree, you can put it up, or particularly their reading, which is even more useful. I'm not saying it's not an intrinsic capacity only. I agree, it's got.
Because it was amazing for children that you actually thought were, on very low level of IQ, that they actually changed and become average or above.
Absolutely, and there's a companion program that we've got just for that called Fostering Education, which is the paired learning approach, which has got a manual also published by BAF, but hasn't had a trial, but completely for that. Would you like to say anything about the Swedish trials of FFT? But not yet.
No, I was not part of the study.
No, but do you have any comments about them?
By the program in Helsingborg.
Yes.
And his fellow researchers. So I wasn't part of the project, but I had it presented for me.
And what would you say what did you take away from those presentations about
I think
FFT
that
in
there's a
Sweden?
Great, you have a lot of good options of improving the situations for this group of children, and you should be careful to define them in a group that is, hopeless or low IQ and can't do anything, because that's how they define themselves, and being defined by teachers, social workers, foster carers sometimes. So when they have these interventions, not quite, I wouldn't say simple, but not very complicated interventions, it had a great effect even on the IQ. But I'll send you.
But I think the Swedish trial didn't work either, so that was important.
No, this was not the GFC. This was the school.
No, the trials of FFT. Sorry, I was wondering if you knew about the functional family therapy trials in Sweden. No.
So this
Okay.
was a school project.
Yeah.
Just
Okay.
focusing
But
on-
I just want to challenge you on that, because the other kids that we see who are living in birth families have all those same characteristics, and I don't think they're very simple. They're very skilled in. They have big effects. So I mean, there've been 60 RCTs of kids with similar things who are in birth families pre-care, and who've done well. So I think these things can work.
Okay, we've got quite a few people now. Lucy and then Sue.
I was just wondering if you could say...
Just introduce yourself.
Sorry,
if you
I'm
don't
Lucy
mind.
Schuker from the University of Bedfordshire. I wonder if you could say a bit more about the fostering changes stuff that you're beginning to do with teens. I know you haven't got a trial going, but one of the things we're sort of interested in here is what things might be out there that would be useful specifically for teens. Could you say something more on how the programme might be different, delivered for older children and younger,
Sure.
and what you might expect, some of the questions that you might ask?
Well, I think, as you might expect with teenage, there's much more about negotiation, listening skills, turn taking, keeping it calm, as well as appreciating and raising their self-esteem by the positive. There's plenty too about education. We do have that formally in as 2 sessions are about education. There is stuff about supervision. There is stuff about the way in which you get close to a teenager is different from playing doll play or something like that with the younger kids, but you've got to have that trusting relationship to increase attachment, to also so that you know what the young person's up to, and so that they feel they want to confide in the carer. So it's adapted to those sort of issues.
And just say something about the numbers involved and when your time scale for that trial.
None. Could you give us some money, please? Perhaps we collaboratively put in for a grant, Judy.
Oh, right, okay. So it's just
There's
starting.
there's no trial. There's no. I would like to, but the
I
climate
see,
has
okay.
changed since 3 years ago, 5 years ago,
Okay.
hugely from the DFE. DFE almost doesn't do research now. Doesn't really.
Important that-
It's got the Educational Endowment Foundation, but it doesn't do families. Parenting has been put back into the Department of Health. Gove is very
Right.
single-minded on
Education
academic.
Endowment Fund won't fund that, is that what you're saying?
No, I don't think so.
Because you collect educational measures as well, don't you, on the...
We do, but yeah, the environment's changed rather.
Okay, Sue,
I just wondered if,
just introduce yourself.
sorry, I'm Sue Walker and I'm from the Youth Justice Board.
Great.
If you, when you looked at the reoffending rates and said that they hadn't improved very much, was there any kind of study done to see whether, to look at the seriousness of the offending that was
Yeah.
done and if that...
No, we looked at that. No, nothing. More serious offenders. Yeah.
And was there any measurement of the more softer outcomes that are not quite as easy to show in data, things like improvement in attitude and engagement in education and things like that? Were they-
Yeah,
they
no.
more likely to
Well,
get to school on time,
Yeah,
stay
yeah,
there?
no changes.
Basically nothing.
Thank you, John. Yeah.
I think what your presentation communicates absolutely to us is the importance of these very rigorous designs in terms of measurement, and just how difficult it is for all of us working with the communities we work with to try and dissuade people from picking up things which are very well
I should say it hasn't
publicised.
dissuaded the DFE, which is now rolling it out.
Yeah.
So, discuss. Yeah.
Right.
I
Okay. I'll take Aoife and then John, yeah? Aoife?
I'm going to ask a self-serving question, which is about my PhD on. So I'm looking at risk and protective factors for children in care, and risk and protective factors for their educational outcomes. I'm a DPhil student. Judy's my supervisor. With the intervention educations, I think some of the issues are that the theory of change isn't very clear. We don't always know what risk factors we're targeting. And I know your interventions are sort of targeting slightly different outcomes. I'm wondering what you think of the evidence base before the intervention set up. What do you feel about the evidence base on the risk factors, and do you feel that these interventions are developed as a response to the evidence on risk factors?
Well, I think poor family relationships are a risk factor, but of course they can be consequential on having a child who's very difficult. It might not be starting off. But I think there's no doubt that having an abusive start in life has lots of bad effects on your security in relationships, on your emotional regulation. There's lots of biological coming out now. People seem to love the brain and cortisol, but these kids are going to get angry very, very quickly and calm down more slowly. They're more likely to be so-called callous unemotional, to be less empathetic to other people, even if they can read emotional situations, say, well, stuff for you, I don't care. So that's harder. So I think one thing we're doing is a trial with callous unemotional kids to see if you can improve by improving their emotional awareness, to reduce so that they, because there's a word from a lady called Koshanska, who's a developmental psychologist in the States, about between 0 and 2, lots of kids develop what she calls deviational anxiety, which is, you feel a bit guilty and worried if you're doing naughty stuff. And it seems that these kids may not develop that. So we all have it to a greater or lesser degree. My partner, if I go 32 miles an hour in London, Stephen, you're going too fast. There's oodles of deviational anxiety. But some of these kids don't have that. But I don't think we know yet how to address those kind of risk factors.
Yes, well, all I want to say was I just thought the explanation that you gave at the end for the results, is absolutely critical, because if we want to try and understand interventions with parents and children or young people, we have to take into account not only the children and young people, but the motivation of the adults. Why are they there? What's going on there? And so, the difference between the foster carers who really, they want to make a difference. They're coming with a motivation to respond, to change, to understand, and the families, in the FFT trial, they've just got so much else going on, so many difficulties, so many complexities, and all the stuff that I've been involved with, interventions for parents of teenagers, unless you really take into account what the parent is bringing to the intervention, then you're simply not going to get a result. You're not going to get whatever you like to call it, buy-in or learning or change or whatever. So I just wanted to say it makes complete sense what you're saying, and I think that it just does underline, if you're talking about a logic model, which Aoife's talking about, what the parent, what the adult brings to the intervention is absolutely central. So I think it really makes complete sense to me.
I think that's probably a good moment to thank you very much, Stephen, because I know you can't stay all day, so let's just thank you now anyway.